That small golden tooth,
Yeah.
Returned by Belgium just recently after 62 years. It's such a tiny object, but wow, it carries the weight of this huge story.
It really does.
That tooth belonged to Patrice Lumumba, a figure who, honestly, should probably be much better known in our understanding of 20th century African history.
Absolutely. It's a very stark reminder, isn't it, of a life cut short, tragically, and a legacy that, well, it still resonates across the continent today.
So today, we're doing a deep dive into Patrice Lumumba's life. He was the first prime minister of the independent Congo. And we're looking at the, let's say, complex web of forces that ultimately led to his assassination.
Yeah, it's quite a story.
And whether you, listening, already know about Lumumba, or maybe this is your first real encounter with his story, our aim here is really to unpack the most crucial and, frankly, compelling parts of his life. We're drawing from a detailed YouTube video transcript.
Right. We want to get a sense of who he was, what he stood for, and why his fate is still so significant, even now.
Exactly. And to really get the significance, you have to understand the context, the ground he stood on. We're talking about the Belgian Congo.
Mm-hmm. And that means facing up to some of the most brutal colonial exploitation imaginable. It really starts with King Leopold II.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit. Leopold II basically treated the Congo like his own private estate, right? A massive area. What, 77 times the size of Belgium?
That's right, his personal fiefdom. And for 23 years, his rule was just horrific forced labor, mostly for rubber.
We're talking systematic mutilation, massacres. The estimates are what, maybe 10 million Congolese people died under his personal rule?
Yep.
It's just staggering brutality.
It is. And look, international pressure eventually forced the Belgian government to take over in 1908. It became a formal colony.
But the core issues didn't really change, did they?
No, not fundamentally. The Congolese were still denied basic political rights, couldn't own land freely, education was extremely limited. They were deliberately kept subordinate.
And it's out of this environment, this deep injustice, that Patrice Lumumba emerges.
Yeah. And his background wasn't initially political, per se. He was a poet, a journalist. He even worked at the post office for a while.
But his writings started to show this deep anti-imperialist feeling. He was seeing the system up close and starting to voice this powerful desire for change.
And there's this interesting moment, or maybe a couple of moments, that seem to act as catalysts. A study tour he took in Belgium in '56,
Right.
followed by this accusation of embezzlement. Now, he always denied those charges, but it seems like that whole experience might have been a real turning point.
Instead of breaking him, it hardened his resolve.
It appears so, yeah. It seems to have really solidified his commitment to independence, pushed him further down that path.
And then, pretty quickly, by 1958, he's only 33, he founds the movement National Congolais, the MNC.
And their platform was, well, quite clear and potent. Immediate independence, state-led economic development, making sure Congolese people actually benefit from Congo's wealth.
Which is key.
And neutrality in foreign affairs. And that point, neutrality, that becomes really important later on.
Absolutely. His vision was for complete independence, which kind of set him apart from some others who were maybe thinking about, continued ties with Belgium in some form.
Exactly. And his Pan-Africanist connections were strong. He attended the All-African People's Conference in Accra, Ghana. He had this relationship with Kwame Nkrumah.
Nkrumah, a major figure himself.
Oh, absolutely. Pan-Africanism was this powerful force at the time, pushing for unity, solidarity, overcoming those colonial borders, achieving self-determination together. Lumumba definitely saw Congo's fight as part of that bigger continental struggle.
Then things accelerate again. He gets arrested, accused of inciting an anti-colonial riot.
Right, but then, while he's actually in prison, his party, the MNC, wins a majority in local elections.
Incredible timing.
Isn't it? The pressure to release him just becomes immense, and it leads to his freedom and, crucially, the agreement for Congo's independence by June 30th, 1960. It's a meteoric rise.
And that moment of independence, it's so revealing. You have King Baudouin of Belgium giving this speech.
Unbelievably praising Leopold II's civilizing mission. Just a complete whitewash of history.
A blatant denial, yeah. And then Lumumba steps up.
Yeah.
And his speech is, well, it's the opposite. It's this powerful, completely unapologetic recounting of the brutal reality of Belgian rule.
He laid it bare. The suffering, the exploitation, the truth that had been systematically pushed aside.
And the reaction, especially from Belgium and the West.
Immediate shock, criticism. They were not prepared for that level of frankness.
But here's where it gets really critical. Beyond just the history, Lumumba wasn't just talking about the past. He was adamant that the new Congo needed control over its own vast natural resources.
Exactly. And one resource stands out, making him a huge target, uranium.
People might not realize, but throughout the 40s and 50s, the Congo was the main supplier of uranium to the U.S.
The main supplier. Something like 80% of the uranium for the bombs dropped on Japan came from Congolese mines.
80%. So the stakes here weren't just high for Belgium, they were incredibly high for the U.S., especially in the Cold War.
Absolutely. It wasn't just economics. It was strategic global power. Controlling that uranium source gave the U.S. a massive edge. Lumumba wanting Congo to control its own resources, that directly challenged the whole power dynamic.
Which leads us directly to the forces that started moving against him. The source material we looked at explicitly mentions White House approval for Lumumba's assassination.
Yeah, now the Church Committee later denied direct U.S. involvement in the actual killing.
Right, the official line.
But it did acknowledge that the CIA station chief was involved in the decision to transfer Lumumba to Katanga, that was a secessionist province, very hostile to him.
And we also hear this account from a former CIA agent about an earlier failed attempt to poison Lumumba.
Yes. So when you put it together, it paints a pretty clear picture of a concerted effort, at least to get him out of power.
And Belgium's role.
Undeniable. Just days after independence, you have these separatist movements popping up. And Belgium, instead of supporting Lumumba's legitimate government, as they sort of initially suggested they might,
they did the opposite.
They deployed their own soldiers to support the rebels. Their goal seems pretty clear. Undermine Lumumba, protect their economic interests.
So Lumumba's facing internal rebellion, external aggression. He turns to the United Nations for help.
And the UN refuses to intervene militarily against the Belgian-backed forces. So in a desperate spot, really.
What does he do?
He seeks support from the Soviet Union. Now, in the Cold War climate...
It's like waving a red flag.
Exactly. Any move toward the Soviet bloc, regardless of the actual reason, was seen as deeply suspicious by the West. It just narrowed his options dramatically and ramped up the efforts to undermine him, especially with that uranium still in play.
Understandable, maybe, given his situation, but it definitely fueled that Western narrative that he was a communist, or at least a sympathizer.
It certainly solidified the resolve of his enemies, yes.
But the story also points to something deeply tragic. Betrayal from within his own circle. Joseph Désiré Mobutu.
Mobutu. Initially Lumumba's ally, he was his Secretary of State, then Chief of Staff of the Army.
A key position.
A very key position. And this is where you see that intersection of personal ambition and geopolitics. Mobutu saw his chance.
Saw Lumumba as an obstacle to his own power.
It seems so. He strategically aligned himself with American and Belgian interests. It's a pattern we unfortunately see elsewhere, personal power becoming more important than national unity when external pressures mount.
And then, the devastating betrayal. Mobutu orchestrates Lumumba's capture.
Yeah, the source details how he worked with Belgian and American interests to actually seize him. It's a grim reminder of how external powers can exploit those internal divisions.
The end.
Yeah.
It was just brutal.
Horrific. Lumumba was captured, tortured alongside his colleagues, Maurice Mpolo and Joseph Okito, and then executed by firing squad.
But it didn't even end there, did it? The disposal of the body.
No. It's particularly gruesome. A Belgian police officer, Gerard Souet, and his brother exhumed the bodies. They dismembered them and dissolved them in sulfuric acid.
Why? To prevent a gravesite. A memorial.
Precisely. To erase any physical trace, any potential shrine. And in this just macabre detail, Soere kept 2 of Lumumba's teeth as trophies. It's hard to comprehend that level of inhumanity.
It really is. And the consequences for Congo, devastating.
Yeah.
Mobutu takes over, rules as a dictator for decades.
3 decades, yeah. Siphoning off wealth, suppressing dissent. And the country is still dealing with instability, the fallout from that whole era.
Belgium has, years later, expressed regret for its role.
Yes, regret. But the speaker in the video rightly points out that the U.S. has largely stayed silent on its own potential involvement.
Despite everything we've discussed.
Despite everything.
But Lumumba's legacy, it endures, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. He remains this incredibly powerful symbol of anti-colonial resistance. People call him a father of democracy in Africa, someone who just bravely demanded real independence, real control over his nation's future and resources.
His Pan-African vision, too, that commitment to self-determination, it still inspires people today.
Definitely. And the source material makes that powerful point about internal betrayal, too. How external forces often need that internal collaborator, someone willing to compromise their own people for personal gain.
It's a really sobering thought, and sadly still relevant in many places.
It is, and that single gold tooth returned after all this time. While it's symbolically significant, you have to say it feels like a very small gesture when you consider the scale of the injustice and its lasting impact.
Yeah. So reflecting on Lumumba's story, the key things that stand out are his just courageous fight for genuine independence, not just flag independence.
Right. And then the formidable forces, both external and internal, that lined up against him. And, of course, the tragic, long-lasting consequences of his assassination for Congo.
And it really makes you think, doesn't it, about the true cost of colonialism. It goes so far beyond the initial violence and extraction. It's about long-term destabilization, undermining real self-determination for generations.
What responsibility do those former colonial powers actually bear for the problems that persist decades later? It's a huge question.
It's one we really need to grapple with.
Indeed. And maybe Lumumba's story is just that a potent, timeless reminder of this ongoing global fight for real self-determination, a fight that needs constant vigilance, against external pressures, but also demands that internal unity and integrity.